Hello health champions! Today I want to talk about what really happens in the body when you're fasting. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. We've been told for so long that it's so important to eat to keep your energy up. That if you don't have breakfast, you won't have any focus in school or at work. But if that was true, then anytime we try to fast, we would just get weaker and weaker. Energy would fade away until we just had nothing anytime we try to fast. But that's not how it works. So instead, how it works is the body has these amazing mechanisms of backup to provide a constant supply of energy pretty much no matter what happens, because our food supply has not always been as consistent as it is today. The first thing that happens when you eat something is that food has to be processed. You put it in the stomach and now it has to be digested and absorbed. It's in the bloodstream, then it gets into the cells, and some of that fuel gets used up in the moment and some of it gets stored. So if we eat a lot of carbohydrate, then most of that in the beginning is going to be glucose. So we're going to use a lot. We're going to use as much as 40 grams per hour of glucose, and part of that is just to get rid of the glucose, and part of it is to process through it quickly so that we can store whatever we're not using in the moment. And the storage form for glucose is called glycogen, and most of that is going to end up in the muscles, and some of it is going to also be stored in the liver. For the first 12 to 16 hours after a meal, if we don't eat again, then glycogen is going to be broken down and it's going to provide most of the glucose for the body, for the brain and the tissues. But as time goes on, the body is going to start looking for another source. It's going to start making glucose from scratch. That's called gluconeogenesis. And if we add up those two sources, the glycogen and the gluconeogenesis, how much we're using from each, then you'll see with this pink line that it's pretty constant. In the beginning, we're just kind of breaking it down, but from 6 hours on up to about 30 hours, then we're depending mostly on glucose unless we are fat adapted. So this example, the initial example, is for someone who's eaten a modern diet with high carb and frequent meals, and then this is what it's going to look like. Over time though, the body is going to start using more fat. In the beginning, it's a pretty low fat consumption, but as time goes that we're not eating, then insulin goes down and we're going to start breaking down some of that fat. And then also we're going to start making more ketones as the glucose goes down. As glucose becomes less and less available, now is when the ketones really kick in, because that's the alternative fuel for the brain. So initially, all the tissues in the body use glucose. They use as much as they can. Firstly, just basically to get rid of the stuff, but also because it's so widely available. It's so abundant. Then in phase 2 and 3, we're relying on glycogen and gluconeogenesis. And now the body is still using mostly glucose, but it's starting to turn more into fat burning gradually. The brain, red blood cells, and a portion of the kidney called the renal medulla is still using pretty much 100% glucose. The brain, because it hasn't adapted to ketones yet, and the red blood cells in the kidney, because they don't have any mitochondria. They can't burn fat for fuel. But then as we get into the second day and beyond, now the body has shifted and it's burning almost exclusively fat. Almost 100% of the liver and muscles and the other tissues are using fat for fuel. because the glucose is being spared for those tissues that can't use fat. So the red blood cells and the renal medulla are still using glucose only. The brain, however, it is gradually starting to shift. So in the beginning of this phase, when we just get into day 2, and if you're not already fat adapted, then it still uses mostly glucose, but toward the end of it, as we get into day 3, 4, and 5, now the ketones have become dominant. And if you're fat adapted and you go beyond 72 hours, now your ketones are going to provide about 75% of the fuel for the brain. So how does the body do gluconeogenesis? Where does that new sugar come from? Well, there's different glucose sources. So first we have glycogen, and that's not really gluconeogenesis because it's already glucose. It's just stored in another form. Then we have lactic acid and pyruvate. And those are byproducts of breaking down glucose for energy when we don't have enough oxygen. So either those tissues, the red blood cells or the kidney, when they can't use fat, or when muscles are working at a high intensity when there's not enough oxygen, then we're using glycolysis and we get lactic acid and pyruvate. So even though this is classified as gluconeogenesis in the textbook, I don't think of it strictly as gluconeogenesis. It's not making glucose from scratch because this stuff was already glucose. It is sort of a net zero game where it's just being hauled around and converted in different tissues. When I talk about true gluconeogenesis, the way I look at it is when the body makes glucose from something that was never glucose. And now it's making it from amino acids or glycerol. Amino acids is from protein, and glycerol is the backbone of fat. It's a portion of fat. So when we're burning fat, we get some glycerol freed up, and that can be converted into glucose. And this is what a lot of people are afraid of with fasting. They hear that we're making glucose from protein and they think, wow, now we're breaking down muscle. I don't want that to happen. Well, it's not really what's happening. It can happen a little bit, but it doesn't happen much and there's ways to avoid it. So in the beginning, before we are fat adapted, now there is going to be between 8 hours and into 24 hours or so, then we are mostly going to break down amino acids for glucose because we're not fat adapted yet, so the glycerol is not really available. But first of all, it's a limited time, and secondly, it's not all muscle tissue. Some of this is loose skin, some of it is old dead cells, and some of it is just junk and debris and pathogens in the body that we're trying to get rid of. And then something else happens, which is autophagy and an increase in growth hormone. So already after about 12 hours, we have a significant increase in growth hormone. And this keeps growing over the next week, so that after 2 days, we already have a 5-fold increase in growth hormone. And this does two things. Both autophagy and growth hormone kind of work together, and they make the body better at recycling. And they also promote fat burning. And when we burn more fat, we make more glycerol available. So now we have that to make glucose from. But growth hormone also builds muscle. It is muscle sparing. And autophagy and growth hormone put together prioritizes using protein for structural tissue, not for fuel. So even though we can burn a little bit of muscle for the first few hours of gluconeogenesis, that's not an ongoing process. And in the long run, there is very, very little loss of muscle. The body is way too smart to be burning protein for fuel when there is any fat available. And then in phase 4 and 5, some other really cool things happen. These are all the benefits from fasting, we get an increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which together with growth hormone is like miracle growth for the brain. What that means is anytime you learn something, you make new connections, you rewire your brain. Anytime you repair something, you rewire your brain. And this happens exponentially better when we have more of these hormones. So fasting and autophagy is some of the best things that we can have for repairing and improving the brain. We further improve immunity, and once we get past the 48 into 72 hours, now the stem cell production, which is involved in body repair and healing, increases tremendously. So our repairability goes up from there. Now, if we look a bit at the time scale here, we see we're starting with hours here, and then we get into day 2 and 3 and 4 and up to day 16 and 32. And you're thinking, wow, that's a really long time to fast. I don't think I can do that. Well, remember, this is what happens when we take people who have a modern lifestyle. They eat a bunch of carbs, they eat frequent meals, they're probably a little overweight and insulin resistant. This is how long it's going to take them to get truly fat adapted, to where their systems are really stable and just going on in a steady state. But it's going to take that long whether you fast or whether you get fat adapted some other way. So if you do a low carb diet or keto diet, then you're going to get fat adapted. This keto curve, this keto production curve of ketones, it's going to be pretty high. It's going to be readily available on an ongoing basis. So if you're fat adapted and you're keto adapted, then you're pretty much never going to leave phase 4. You're going to eat here and there. Your body's going to build up some glycogen for emergencies, but you're still going to have that metabolic flexibility that you're pretty much just going to exist in phase 4. So what I recommend people do, based on our knowledge of all these benefits, is if you have reached a health state, if you've reached a weight that you're happy with, then you're looking for maintenance. And now what you do is you maintain a low-carb, high-fat diet, which again, where you are on that scale is low carb 30 grams or 50 or 80. It's going to depend on you, and you got to figure out where you are. I also recommend that you do some form of intermittent fasting. It could be a 16-8 or an 18-6, meaning you eat for 6 hours during the day and you fast the other 18. And depending on how easy or hard it is for you to gain weight or lose weight, some people lose too much weight, and some people put weight back on. So therefore, you're going to probably alternate somewhere between 18-6 and OMAD, depending on the person. I can't do OMAD all the time because I lose too much weight, but I want the benefits of this extended fasting, so I alternate between these two. And then what you can do is make a longer fast once or twice a month. So if you have dinner at 6 and then you don't eat at all the next day, and then you have breakfast, you got a 36-hour fast. If you skip breakfast, go to lunch, you got a 42-hour fast. And I think it's a great idea to do this once or twice a month. Then, a couple of times a year, maybe once a quarter, maybe twice a year, you do a longer fast. Because if you go beyond 3 days, now you're getting into some serious stem cell production, some deep states of autophagy and repair. And this is pretty much what I do. This is what I would recommend for maintenance. However, if you are looking to reverse a condition, maybe you have a disease, maybe you have some obesity, maybe you have some cancer or some autoimmunity, now you just want to do maybe a little bit more. You don't have to. If this does the trick for you, then just do that. But if you notice that that weight still won't budge, then you do a little more as needed. So now maybe you do more OMAD, maybe you skip the 18-6 altogether, maybe you do 18-6 once a week, maybe you do the 36 to 42-hour fast once a week instead of twice a month, and maybe you do the 3 to 5 days all the way up to 7 or 10 days, and you do that once a month or every 6 weeks or something like that. So there's no hard and set rule for how to do this. You got to figure out how your body works, how are you feeling when you do these things, and most importantly, don't rush into it. Do this gradually, learn how your body functions, learn how it feels, and then you move on from there. If you enjoyed this video, you're really going to love that one next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.